Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Blue Lineage podcast series. On today's episode, we really start to get into the heart of rock and roll. Uh, in this episode, a lot of the core artists that make up really definitive rock and roll songs. At this point, we've talked about a lot of artists that had bits and pieces. Last episode, there were definitely artists that were uh, more strongly R&B and had a rock and roll vibe. You could have considered them rock and roll certainly, but in this episode, it's pretty clear cut. And as you can see, as you go through the timeline, we have pretty much a string of artists for a while now. No more terminology for a little bit. So that's what I like to get into is straight music and art. There's always a little cultural and social aspects to this, but talking about the artists, I think it keeps things moving and can kind of connect the dots a little bit more clearly when we go from artist to artist. So on the timeline first, we have Big Joe Turner, and Big Joe Turner was born in Kansas City, Missouri, and he was primarily a vocalist. He had a deep, cutting voice. His music would have been considered R&B once again, that kind of coming from that jump blues background. But he has one of the very definitive rock and roll hits along the way, and so he's probably our first real rock and roll artist with his song, which we'll talk about, his big hit song, a little bit later. We'll get into that. But a little bit of his background. There's pretty limited information on his early life, actually. One of the main, unfortunate things really that's known about him is his father was killed in a railroad accident. So he was raised by his mother and grandmother. He grew up singing in churches and street corners, like a lot of the younger vocalists that we talked about who grew up in city life. One of the things about him is Big Joe Turner. His name kind of fits his image throughout his life, so he looked a lot older than he actually was. So even when he was young, still in his early teens, he started to perform in the nightclubs in Kansas City, which was, provided him with a lot of early experience that a lot of people don't get. And as he performed in the nightclubs, he would also work, like bartend there. And apparently one night he met his soon to be collaborator and long-term partner in music, Pete Johnson, who was a piano player. And so once that they hit it off there, they built up a reputation. They started to put a few things together. And at one point, while they were performing in a club, John Hammond, who was a well-known music scout and concert/music producer, he got word of Joe and he saw them in the club, and he invited them to record in New York. And so this is around 1938, and early on in some of the early sessions, they recorded what was one of Big Joe Turner's kind of signature hits, which was called Rollin' Pete, formerly known as It's All Right, Baby, and he recorded this at the Vocalion label. They also recorded for Decca Records later on in 1941, and during this time they were performing pretty consistently together, but once they got to Decca Records in 1941, they had been working together for a while, so the relationship kind of started to fray. They continued to perform together on and off, but that was kind of what got them both started, specifically for Big Joe Turner. And so after a while, they kind of split ways, and Big Joe Turner, moved to Los Angeles in the early 1940s, and he was performing around there for a while. And in 1947, he recorded My Gal's Jockey with National Records, which was really his first radio hit. During that time, he in LA, he recorded for a bunch of different labels, all through the 1940s, and then when we hit 1950, he recorded with young Fats Domino, who we'll talk about a little bit later in this episode. That song was called Still in the Dark. And so by this time, his career has slowed pretty significantly. One of the things to look at with Big Joe Turner is, he recorded his first hit in 1938. So that would have marked pretty early in our timeline. And just to keep track of his age, because he hits a hard point around, the 1950s. He did get a fill-in spot with Count Basie's group, and that got him a contract with Atlantic Records. And Atlantic Records, during this time was, that was the place to be for what was considered R&B at the time, but a lot of the big rock and roll musicians that we talk about during this era, Atlantic, was huge at the time. So he got that signing with Atlantic Records, and his first track, Chains of Love, got him back on the charts, and it marked the beginning of the most successful recording period of his career. He had tracks called Sweet 16, Chill Is On, Don't You Cry, and his first track to actually top the charts was Honey Hush. And then in 1953, he moved to Chicago, and he recorded a track with Elmer James, another legend who's not on the timeline, but blues legend. He recorded a track called TV Mama with Elmer James. And so around this time, he was still with Atlantic Records. Jesse Stone, who was a pianist, and he was also a prolific songwriter. He worked for Atlantic Records, and he wrote Shake, Rattle, and Roll for Joe Turner in 1954. And Jesse Stone and Big Joe Turner had already crossed paths at one point earlier in his career. And so when Jesse Stone wrote the song, Big Joe Turner had a big, sort of voice that just cut through the record or through the venue wherever it was performing. He just had a dominant voice, and so he wrote the song with that in mind. And Shake, Rattle, and Roll is, pretty clearly a rock and roll song. Of course, during this time, it would have still appeared on R&B charts, but Jesse Stone, because of this, and just during that time period, he had been involved in the music industry, in the music scene as a musician also for a while, and he had kind of been working on some of these building blocks that resembled early rock and roll, and Shake, Rattle, and Roll was kind of that culmination of all of that. So Jesse Stone is really credited with, creating some of those early building blocks of rock and roll. Shake, Rattle, and Roll, a big hit. It was perfect for Big Joe Turner's sort of, he had this really hard jump blues style that was already kind of edging towards rock and roll, similar to what we looked at with Ruth Brown and some of her songs. this is all around the 1950s. So this is where rock and roll really starts going, and you can kind of see these artists like Big Joe Turner, just the natural progression from jump blues, kind of getting that harder rhythm matching with the vocals, and you can see how it kind of naturally progresses to what became rock and roll. And the song actually, I don't know if it was intentional or sort of just coincidental, or just, Jesse Stone, he had a background in blues piano, as I said. So the song actually makes like kind of a lot of callbacks from early lines in older blues songs. It's something to look into if you're interested, but it really kind of, older blues too. So it kind of just takes some, not necessarily well-known, probably some more, I guess you could say, niche songs from anywhere from country blues to some of the more mainstream-ish blues songs that were from the earlier days, and adds them to the song, which I think was done sort of colorfully, not, in a way where they're kind of stealing it away. It was almost kind of paying homage to a certain extent, although, I'm not sure that any of those songs were necessarily like household classics. So, could have been seen as a little bit of a minor theft, but I think it's pretty cool, something that's interesting to look into. But the way that the song was similar to songs that we talked about before, it was seen as too suggestive, and so that really reduced the radio play and it limited its exposure. But as I said, it was still successful. It was a new song, a new type of song that hadn't really been heard before. But eventually both Bill Haley and Elvis Presley recorded versions that were, radio appropriate, or seen as radio appropriate, radio friendly, and they were way more successful, much more successful as far as, reception, listener reception, and radio play. So the success of Shake, Rattle, and Roll really continued to, kind of fuel that resurgence of Big Joe Turner's career. And one thing to remember is, as I was talking about before, is his age. He was actually 43, in his 40s already, when he released this major song. So he had a little bit of early success, not really in the mainstream, had a clear slump, and then he really came back, and it was really in his 40s, which is not so common for musicians to have at least their really initial resurgence at this point in their life. So he got some films, some TV. TV was becoming a big thing at that time, including a show called Showtime at the Apollo. But at least for black artists, rock and roll was a little bit short-lived. A lot of it had to do with the music phenomenon, the British invasion, which we'll talk about. It's kind of a reoccurring theme for these rock and roll guys throughout the episode. So as that kind of took over, he shifted to more of a performing like jazzy numbers. But one note is in 1969 he did make an album with T-Bone Walker and Otis Spann, who are pretty big stars. Of course, T-Bone Walker was featured early on the timeline, but those big three were pretty big. They had big careers, success in their own right. And so in 1969, which is much later down the road, past what would probably be considered the prime of their careers, they put together this session that refers to them as the Super Black Blues Band, and the title of the album is also called Super Black Blues. And it's not really a commercially known album, but it's a cool album if you are into any of those artists individually, but also I think it represents the timeline pretty well because it encapsulates Big Joe Turner and T-Bone Walker, and kind of shows them later in their career after they're kind of past their success, trying to make hits. It's kind of almost a more laid back. They're kind of jamming a little bit, so it's a fun album to listen to if that's your vibe. Pretty, there's some slow blues. I would say it's more of a slow blues type album with, all of them had a little bit of a different background, so a lot more gets mixed in there, but I would say that the core of it is pretty bluesy. And that's one of the things about the blues that I think is interesting when you think about the blues versus the rock and roll era, and how the rock and roll era kind of died out to a certain extent. Really, it didn't necessarily die out, but it grew into something else. And the blues, kind of evolved, as we talked about. We had the country blues, Delta blues, and how it evolved into the electric blues over time. We talked about T-Bone Walker and B.B. King, and that kind of just, stayed. It kept its course, and it actually experienced a revival around this time. And since how that kind of continues to live today, where rock and roll, had its moment, a huge moment, a very definitive moment in American history, but it didn't progress, or at least for these artists who kind of made up the core of rock and roll, it kind of died out for them and continued to become something else. And of course, a lot of this has to do with crossover from the R&B charts to the pop charts. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. And then in the 1980s, he kept performing, but his health was declining, and he passed away in 1985. So that's basically Big Joe Turner, big contributor to the early sound of rock and roll, when we're really getting into the core of it, as we'll see with these other artists that we'll talk about. Next on the list is Little Richard. And so Little Richard, he's really known for his boogie woogie infused, rock and roll piano. That was really his background. We talked about boogie woogie quite a few episodes ago. Well, I guess there's not that many episodes at this point, but probably episode 2, I would imagine. It comes up when we talk about jump blues, and kind of the basis of jump blues is being kind of the swing sound with boogie woogie, which is as old as the blues. It's really a type of blues, piano based. So Little Richard was from Macon, Georgia. He had 11 siblings, and his family was kind of an interesting contrasting mix, I would say, of they had contrasting mix of lifestyles, I guess you can say, because some of his family was very strictly religious, and his other family was bootleggers, which, of course was essentially a life of crime to a certain extent during those days, selling alcohol and whatnot, when, you weren't really supposed to be. I suppose today that's, not really seen the same way as it was at the time, but you can see how, a strict religious side would clash with that sort of lifestyle. So that's kind of interesting. He learned to play piano and perform at church. That was really where he got his start in music. And Little Richard was reportedly kicked out of his house at the age of 13. People mostly think that it's due to his sexuality, family members, or his dad. There's different stories. It was never really confirmed by him, but he was kicked out of his house one way or another, or left his house at the age of 13. And so during this time, he worked at carnivals and he worked in vaudeville for a little bit. And he ended up being taken in by Ann and Johnny Johnson. And they ran the TikTok Club in Macon. And that's where he was able to start performing, on stage at least, while also working at the club. So in the 1940s, he performed for a little bit with the Sugarfoot Sam's minstrel show, and we've talked about minstrel shows quite a bit, so I'm not going to go into the background of that. But at one point, one of the female performers was not able to show up for the show, and so Little Richard ended up going out in drag as a character that was called Princess Lavon. And so the success of this character and persona that he developed on the show, it led him to perform at some other shows, also in drag, different shows around the South, including the LJ Heath show, which had multiple performers in drag, which is mostly just interesting because when you think about the South, outside of maybe New Orleans and Atlanta, you don't necessarily associate the South with, especially during these times, with having a significant drag scene. I know mostly I know from listening to Big Freedia talk a little bit about the New Orleans drag scene, and kind of the history there. So I know that there were definitely clearly pockets and scenes there, and I know there was some at Atlanta, but I'm not sure on the history on that. But I know New Orleans was a big scene. But considering the time, and considering the location, it's something that I think stands out a little bit. But with that said, Little Richard was performing, doing this at circuses and minstrel shows. So it's not necessarily that in all these cases or any of these cases that, the portrayals of, these characters or individuals was necessarily like positive or like progressive in thinking. But, I think it's still interesting. And at one point, he started to frequent the New Orleans clubs, New Orleans club scene, including Dewdrop Inn, which was Dewdrop Inn was one of the centers of black music in New Orleans at the time. And the MC and host was Patsy Vidalia, who was a female impersonator in the 1940s, late 1940s, at least at that club. Patsy Vidalia had performed at other venues, but eventually ended up at the Dewdrop Inn. And Patsy Vidalia was, if you're not familiar with a female impersonator, that's kind of an old, outdated term that I don't think you hear very much. But there's a female impersonator differentiates between drag or drag queen, specifically at those times. A lot of times the terms were used interchangeably, but female impersonator, you could specifically refer to the actual impersonation. Some of the female impersonators really focused on specific female characters, but and some of the female impersonators took offense if they were called drag queens. And so that was just kind of the situation then. But Patsy Vidalia was really known as a great performer, and specifically had really great showmanship, and that partially influenced Little Richard. Because if you know anything about Little Richard was a very good, legendary showman. Um, so that was then. New Orleans was a big hot spot, as I said, for the black music scene, and Patsy Vidalia also hosted the annual Halloween Gay Ball, which was a big event at the time. And in 1951, Little Richard kind of moved on a little bit from that scene, and he got a contract from RCA Records. He got it through an audition. Some say he sent in a tape. Some people say that it's mostly kind of a consensus that he got the audition through some sort of contest or something contest like. But either way, he got a contract with RCA Records, and his early recordings were not really successful. But in 1955, he was performing with a New Orleans band that included a few well-known musicians, Earl Palmer and Lee Allen. And in 1955, he recorded Tutti Frutti, which is one of his biggest hits of his whole career, and it was really his first hit, and went on to be one of his best-known songs. And the original version was really considered to be outrageous and suggestive, similar to other songs. If you look at the original lyrics of this song, I think it's a little bit more understandable considering the time period. But it's definitely a theme. And in this case, it was cleaned up by a songwriter named Dorothy LeBoustrie, and there's one story where Little Richard says that he was, he knew that the song's content was a little bit outrageous for the time for sure, and he actually recited the song to Dorothy LeBoustrie looking at the wall because he was embarrassed about the song. I don't know how true that was. I haven't seen that as a quote. So, but he had come up in a very kind of niche club scene that was also the core of black music in New Orleans and other southern clubs that were similar. So he picked up a style and a language that was not necessarily something that was globally accepted, especially at that time. And so not only was Tutti Frutti a big hit, but it also really showcased Little Richard's style as it became a hit, and he performed it. And he had a very extravagant performance style. As many of you may have seen, Little Richard often played the piano standing up, and his whole style, his appearance, everything was very extravagant. And Tutti Frutti is another one of those songs that is considered the first rock and roll hit, and in this case it's considered first rock and roll hit because it was not only successful on the R&B charts, but it was the first rock and roll song to cross over onto the pop charts, and one of the first songs really from what would be considered black music to cross over to the pop charts. And so that was a huge deal, and it kind of at this point I think Tutti Frutti without a doubt is known as a rock and roll song. Shake, Rattle, and Roll by Big Joe Turner, a rock and roll song. But there's still that argument where you could say some of the songs that we talked about earlier are just some of the overall competition that people, academics on one corner who have a whole list of potential first rock and roll songs, or just the general music community who look back at this time period, consider the rock and roll songs. But at this point, with Tutti Frutti, it's a clear delineation when you talk about a song that sounds like rock and roll and now has exploded the pop charts and really shows, where it kind of separates itself in that way. And since it crossed over to the pop charts, this is one of the songs or time periods that's really credited with a lot more integration in the club scene for young people. It was briefly mentioned early on, just kind of how blues, as some of the lesser known hits, or not lesser known, but older blues artists from before, like Charlie Patton, and some of the ones that really got some success, how the white audience was already interested, and before radio, that the only way to really see music was to either consume it by buying the record, or to go to the club. And so young people were already to some degree integrating. Sometimes it was more just at a party scene, more of a private location. But at this point, with the crossover pop charts, now everybody's listening to it on the radio, and one way or another, you have a wide audience who wants to see Little Richard live. And as I said, Little Richard, a great showman and performer. So there's a whole nother aspect. If you're listening to the song rock and roll and first hearing rock and roll, it's already a song or a type of music that really, faster paced, something that you would want to dance to, and so that's gonna, of course, encourage you to want to see it live. So if you have the opportunity, especially for young people, they think differently. It was a big moment for integration in a world that was still widely segregated, especially in the South. And either way, whether it was mandated or not, North or South, during these times, there was a clear segregation that was just occurring in clubs in general, whether it was, sort of outright, by legally, or just kind of how the culture operated socially at the time. So one of the key aspects of Tutti Frutti was, Little Richard had this boogie woogie style, but he shifted kind of from the shuffle rhythm that was associated with jump blues and blues, in general, and he kind of had this driving eighth beat with his right hand, his rhythm hand on the piano. And so that was one of the key shifts and contributions to rock and roll, and that rock and roll song, and what really makes it clearly a rock and roll song, where before, as I said, you can make an argument for songs to fit into different areas, but when you're really restructuring the song in the way that Little Richard did, it makes it it's another argument to make it pretty clear cut. But at this point, there's no argument that Tutti Frutti is rock and roll. That the debate is more about the first rock and roll song. So you can take, I think on everybody's list, Tutti Frutti is going to be the rock and roll song, whether it's the first one, or people are saying, because of words people use or different aspects, or an overdriven sound, whether theirs is technically the first. That's kind of where the debate starts. But I think for everybody, the debate either begins or ends with not ends, but everyone considers Tutti Frutti a rock and roll song, is what I'm trying to say. And so, similar to patterns that we've talked about before, in this case, Pat Boone was the one. He created a watered down version that charted higher than Little Richard's. As the 1950s progressed, Little Richard went on. That was kind of his Kickstarter song, his first hit, but he, just released a string of songs, including Long Tall Sally, Slip and Slide In, and Good Golly Miss Molly. He sold about 18 million singles, and I believe that was the 18 million singles, rivaled, pop artists, which was another, it was another big hallmark for his career and just the career of where black music and that genre was heading. And because he crossed over in the pop charts, he got opportunities to be featured in a number of rock and roll movies, including The Girl Can't Help It and Don't Knock the Rock. And Little Richard's personality didn't just stay on the stage. He was known for having, kind of a wilder life, as, anyone who's heard anything about Little Richard probably have heard stories, but he had basically had a wilder, party life. And one note about his lifestyle is that he was known to keep thousands of dollars in the trunk of his Cadillac. One club owner, venue owner noted giving Little Richard, just a ton of cash at one point, and he just opened his trunk and put it in his Cadillac, which is, it's an interesting way to live with money. But he apparently wanted this, he wanted the cash in his trunk, so, in case he needed it. So in that case, you can tell that he was used to spending large amounts of cash, sort of, I don't want to say impulsively, but he would spend a large amount of cash at once, without really much planning, is what that would suggest. So in the late 1950s, his career kind of came to a halt, and he was living this rock star lifestyle, one of those early rock stars, and he attributed to seeing, he didn't know at the time, but he saw something fly across the sky. Turned out to be Sputnik, the satellite, and he took this, he was in Australia at the time, and he took this as a sign to return to his religious roots. So he, basically the story goes, he gave his keys to his Cadillac to his mother, and he went back to church, and he took his first hiatus from the music scene. And basically during this time, he, was focusing on religion, Christianity, but he did record a few gospel songs. So then in 1963, after he felt a resurgence of notoriety because the Beatles credited him as an influence, he returned to music. And one note during this time, during the resurgence, is Jimi Hendrix joined Little Richard and the Upsetters. The Upsetters was his band. He joined them for a brief period of time, saying he wanted his guitar to sound like Little Richard's voice. And we'll get into this more on the timeline. There's a specific section that talks about Jimi Hendrix playing with the Upsetters, and we'll talk about it more, as I said, but it's a significant time period because the Upsetters were noted as one of the first bands to start to develop funk, and this was something that was noted by James Brown, who was also on the timeline. We'll talk about him later on. And Jimi Hendrix was only with the band for a little bit because he basically kept stepping on Little Richard's toes, figuratively, too many times. He was, a little bit overly flamboyant. He wanted to kind of do his own thing to a certain extent, and try to took the spotlight from Little Richard a few too many times, basically. And so with Little Richard, he didn't really alter his style. If you listen to Little Richard's songs, it's pretty consistent throughout his catalog. There's the gospel songs, and he collaborated with some artists a little bit later, much later in his career. And so because of that, And as I said, a lot of the rock and roll artists at this time, he found himself just playing his old hits, because that's basically what people were demanding. And so, as time went on, he for years he had been the drug use had been an issue or a thing in his life, and it started to catch up to him and impact his life. And specifically following the death of his brother in the late 1970s, he took another hiatus to return to and focus on Christianity. And so it wasn't until the mid 1980s where he kind of found a balance, as he would say, a balance or a reconciliation between the music or rock star or music scene and Christianity. And so he returned to music again, and around this time he was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he really continued to perform into the 2000s. And he actually passed away pretty recently. He passed away, it would have been like almost a year from the recording of this podcast episode in 2020, a year and a week. So that's Little Richard. And as I said, that's kind of the theme with a lot of these rock and roll artists, where the genre kind of moved on without them, and they kind of get stuck in this kind of loop of just playing the same hits over and over. Next on the timeline is Fats Domino. He was born Antoine Domino in Crescent City, New Orleans. And he was known for pioneering the early sounds of New Orleans R&B and also rock and roll. And he was raised in a musical family. His father was a well-known violinist, and it was his brother-in-law who actually taught him how to play piano, which he started playing at the age of 10. He dropped out of high school at 14, and he worked in a factory during this time, and he was making enough money so he could also perform in nightclubs to hone his craft. And one of the early interests and one of the early influences he notes is Albert Ammons, who was a well-known boogie-woogie pianist from the area. And in the 1940s, he joined the Dave Bartholomew Band, which is a pretty well-known band, at least at that time in the area. And he performed with them for a while. And then in 1949, he signed with Imperial Records. And one of his first songs was his, well, actually, it was the first session produced one of his hit songs called The Fat Man, which I think it was a first session because he had already been sort of constructing it earlier on. So it was just a matter of kind of getting it down and recorded. And this is another song that is considered to be one of the first rock and roll songs and a core rock and roll song. And if you listen to it, it's pretty clearly one of the first rock and roll songs. But in this case, it wasn't the same. It didn't have the same level of crossover as Little Richard's did. But there were a number of these, quote unquote crossover hits, where it basically refers to these black artists recording rock and roll songs that would have been on the R&B chart that crossed over to pop charts, because there was no rock and roll at the time. It was rock and roll. You had R&B and pop. And so the Fat Man, as you may or may not recall, I talked about when we talked about Champion Jack Dupree, because Champion Jack Dupree recorded a song called Junker Blues, and the Fat Man was based on the Junker Blues. And it was around this time where he apparently also took on the name Fats Domino as his stage name. And in 1955, he recorded Ain't That a Shame, which was another hit. Pat Boone, who we just talked about, he once again recorded the same song, and it actually charted #1 on the pop charts, where Ain't That a Shame by Fats Domino didn't make it quite so high. And this is kind of a reoccurring theme as I talk about, and I think it's really a good example of like a cultural appropriation. I think in these days cultural appropriation comes up a lot, and one of the things about this time period in music was you had a lot of black artists charting high enough or being socially accepted by the mainstream for the first time, and getting a much more success than they had in the past. And then reoccurring theme is the white artists taking the songs, either covering it exactly how it was written, or covering a more socially acceptable or radio friendly version. And I think it's a really good example of cultural appropriation, just because in this case they're taking a song that was really based on the experiences, the culture of the black community, and you're kind of extracting some of the parts that don't fit with the mainstream community, which would be the white community in this case, and then you're taking that and releasing it and making a significant profit or success over that. And so I think it's a pretty good definition, because I think sometimes that term might be thrown around pretty liberally, but I think in this case you have a clear case where one culture is really extracting, taking something that was from one culture and really extracting and altering it so it can be more profitable and successful in another scenario. And that's something that Pat Boone in this case has been on the list a couple times doing that. And of course Elvis Presley is probably the most well-known, but I think if you're gonna, in Elvis Presley's case, if you're gonna take that approach, you should probably be the best at it, and be a great musician and great artist in your own right. And I think Elvis Presley kind of gets a lot of flack because he is kind of that the figure that everyone attributes that to. But I think he was so successful at doing that. I think that he obviously got so much success from that approach, and he had his own songs. It's not like he stole everything, but I think being considered one of the kings of rock and roll and really taking it to the top, I think that Elvis Presley almost gets a pass to a certain extent, because he did it in a way that no one else probably could. And I think there can be one. If you're at the top, you got to be the best. And so these other individuals, I think the focus could just be more on the entire situation, where we just saw this reoccurring pattern, rather than focusing on Elvis Presley is what I think I'm trying to get at, because it was clearly something that occurred over and over again. And a lot of these artists, although they were more successful than previous artists in the genre, they never matched the financial or commercial success of some of these other artists. And sometimes, especially during those times, artists were taking the songs, and it's not like today where you have YouTube or all these other avenues where someone would immediately say, this is a song that was done by somebody else, or there would be a clear copyright, flag that would pop up right away. So a lot of times you have people listening to completely different radio stations, and those radio stations are going to play, songs only by those artists, or a certain range of artists. And especially when you're talking about people taking songs from the R&B charts and putting them into the pop charts, it was especially damaging because a lot of radios, played within those top 40 or just the pop chart arena. So a lot of people are going to only hear this version of the song, and that's what they're going to attribute the song to. So they're getting, just kind of it's a really a big boost. I think if you think about it in today's terms, it's not as, it's not as damaging, just because, you'll hear covers here and there, and one way or another, you're probably going to find out, who the original person is. Usually, just because of the way that music business is run now, the individual is going to at least get, royalties or something out of that. And in this case, some of the artists did get royalties, but I think at that point, in a lot of cases, the damage had been done. And regardless, just because of the social and cultural climate, it was a bigger deal. So I think that, like I said, I think Elvis gets overly focused on for kind of borrowing or, stealing, taking, however you want to take it. But overall, the bottom line is it was a reoccurring pattern, and I think there's, you don't want to conflate or confuse, the sort of borrowing or taking of music and the influence, because as we know, as blues grew and this genre grew, it influenced everybody, and rock and roll, rock, the resurgence of sort of this blues rock and what it evolved into, it was all based on and influenced by, these artists on the timeline. So, you want to make sure you separate those also, because, the same thing was happening within the culture. You can see a clear evolution of blues and R&B and rock and roll as we continue to move up to other genres, and they were, doing the same thing to a certain extent, and we had artists doing the same thing. But one of the things, and why I think it's such a good place to talk about cultural appropriation, is because, when you're evolving music that way, and these artists are kind of, because artists have copied or taken elements from music, since the beginning, but there's a difference when you're kind of paying tribute, or you're appreciating it because, this individual is from your culture, you can relate to it, and you're kind of taking it and applying it to your own music. And, or some of the later artists who may not have been in the culture, who have a clear, who didn't take the music, but have a clear, understanding, and did their due diligence and really, studying the music, and then taking elements and putting that into their own music. So I think I think there's, some big differences in there, and, that should be more of the focus than kind of singling out some of these individual artists. Anyways, so Fats Domino, he, after this happened, the first time with Pat Boone, the same thing happened again with Ricky Nelson when he recorded I'm Walkin'. And that song really launched Ricky Nelson's career. He was like a young, kind of a sensation, teenage, pop sensation at the time. And so because of this, Fats Domino, he really, looked at his music and tried to retool some of his songs to make it more radio friendly, so he could get more commercial success. And you can see that because the Fat Man, he, the version he performed originally and the version, if you see him perform it later, you can look at some of the lyrics that he changed. There was like some drug references in the original Fat Man. And, once again, this is the cultural aspect where, one culture sees this one way as being, a part of the culture, whether it's good or bad, and kind of expressing that. And then, this, for the mainstream, it becomes offensive, especially during those times, and you retool it and kind of extract that and turn it into commercial success, which is, I think, it's a little bit unfortunate. But his most successful hit was Blueberry Hill, which, I think for when he was kind of taking on the song, it was a conscious, some of that was still in his conscious as far as making commercially appealing hits, moving forward. And so Blueberry Hill, although he didn't write it, it was a song that was already out there, but was in a much, it was completely different. It was in a different genre. Louis Armstrong actually had recently recorded a version of it at the time. So, Louis Armstrong, very jazz, sort of more in that classical realm of music. And so Fats Domino turned it into a rock and roll song. But, I think with that consciousness of keeping it as what it was to some degree to make it what turned out to be his most commercially successful song. And he had some other hits, Blue Monday, Whole Lotta Loving, My Girl Josephine, Walking to New Orleans, and Let the Four Winds Blow. And so, in the 1960s, one note is only Elvis Presley sold more records than Fats Domino, which is pretty big for an artist at that time. He also appeared in The Girl Can't Help It, which I just mentioned with Little Richard. It was a rock and roll film. And then in the 1960s, he, as I mentioned with every other artist on this timeline, every artist on this episode, his career started to, it was stalemated a little bit, and he found himself just in the oldies circle, which is what happened to a lot of the rock and roll performers. But he did record a successful cover of Lady Madonna in 1969, which is a song you may not know by the Beatles, pretty famous. And it was interesting because the Beatles stated, originally recording it, it was created out of inspiration for Fats Domino, and it was trying to emulate his style. So it's interesting that later on, Fats Domino was re-recording the song and had some success with it when it was kind of inspired by him. An interesting cycle there. And so, other than that, he was really in the oldie circuit, performing his hits, rock and roll hits for, that crowd. And his name really didn't resurface significantly until 2006. And it was pretty unrelated to music, but his name resurfaced in 2006 before Hurricane Katrina was about to hit New Orleans. Because he refused to leave New Orleans because of his wife was in bad health. So he stayed there. And at one point, they were trying to find him, and they couldn't find him, so they thought that maybe Fats Domino was dead. But his daughter, I believe, identified him in a photo or something like that. And so, he's found, and it was pretty soon, though, after the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And he was actually airlifted with his wife out of the area. And he actually, around that time, President Bush gave him a replacement National Medal of Arts because his National Medal of Arts got taken away in the flood, which, if he had to be airlifted, obviously it was in an area where there was significant flooding. So I'm assuming a lot of his stuff, was airlifted, so it's not like he was able to take his stuff out of his home. So I don't know what was recovered. But anyways, that was kind of the where he resurfaced, and he continued to perform for a while in the 2000s, and he actually passed away pretty recently in 2017. So that's Fats Domino. As you can see, all these artists on this episode it's all about rock and roll, core rock and roll artists. And the next artist is Bo Diddley. Bo Diddley was he was originally known as Ellis Bates. He was born in Mississippi. His mother was a sharecropper, and she was just in her teens when he was born. And so he ended up being taken in by his cousin, his mother's cousin. And his cousin, he was actually raised with his cousin and their other, family members, children from his family who were his cousin also raised. And he changed his name to Ellis McDaniel, which was the name that he took on, for the rest of his life. And it was because he could enter public schools as they moved to Chicago, where he attended school. And he was a famous blues and rock and roll guitarist. His first instrument was actually the violin. He played the violin until he was 15, but during that time, he also took up the drums, and he also started to learn guitar. And eventually, in his teens, he just focused on the guitar. And eventually, he dropped out of high school, and he played with his band. His band was known as the Hipsters. They also changed their name to the Langley Alley Cats at one point. And briefly in his career, just to note, he tried out or attempted to be a heavyweight boxer. There's actually a couple. I know champion Jack Dupree, and I believe there's one more person on the timeline who was a boxer, and that was just one of those. There were restricted avenues for black people during those times, to where you could get a job, obviously, and there are certain areas of success, and certainly depending on your background, your educational background, it would have opened up different avenues. But especially without education, but just in general, there are only a few avenues of success that really led to real financial gain during those times. And boxing was one of them, and of course entertainment was another. He also worked at a grocery store, a picture frame factory, and he was an elevator operator. And by 23, he started to play regularly at the 708 Club in Chicago, among other clubs, and he became really well known in the Chicago club scene. And so in the 1950s, when rock and roll, as we can see by some artists that we talked about, they had their first rock and roll hits. They were all in the early 1950s, early 1950s. So as this rock and roll started to take off, he saw that and wanted to try writing that type of music. And so eventually he was signed by Chess Records. And when he was signed with Chess Records, bandmate recommended he go by the name Bo Diddley, which apparently was sometimes called as a child. And there's an old rumor. Some people will say that he was named after Diddley Bo, but Bo Diddley has said before that he didn't even know what Diddley Bo was until someone brought up to him later after he had taken on the name Bo Diddley. But and when we talked about Muddy Waters, I probably mentioned that Muddy Waters, one of his first instruments was the diddley bow, and the diddley bow was it was like a coarsely made string instrument where you basically strung metal strings between two objects. In some cases, I think in most cases, to resemble a guitar, it would be a plank. So you would string, two metal strings across a plank and secure them at both ends, and then the plank would kind of be like a fretboard, and then you could use like a slide or a glass slide, whatever kind of slide, to change notes. And I know Robert Johnson, I'm not sure, maybe it was Robert Johnson that I mentioned it with, because Robert Johnson, he played a diddley bow, but his diddley bow was actually, supposedly it was the strings were nailed in the outside of his house or home, and so he nailed the strings in the wall, and the strings ran down, and he actually supposedly secured them at the bottom, so they would be tight with a brick, and so then he played the strings that way on the side of the house. So there are many iterations. If you look up diddley bow, you can probably find more of like a formalized version, but a lot of the young blues legends or blues artists started off on a diddley bow because they couldn't get a guitar. Actually, if you watch the movie Honey Drippers, I don't know if I've mentioned this movie before, but I believe in the opening scene, they are playing a diddley bow, if I remember correctly. But there's various versions of this. I know Buddy Guy talks about his first guitar, which seems like it would have been a diddley bow. He took the strings out of his. He grew up on a sharecropping farm. He took the strings out of the screen door. He took the wire out of the screen door, and made it into what I would think would resemble a diddley bow. But either way, I think the more likely reason that diddley bow may have came up with Bo Diddley as some of the stories suggest, he was called diddley bow as a child, and during those times, because it was a coarse instrument, kind of like you would almost think of it as like an instrument, when you couldn't afford a guitar. So later on, most likely it just became evolved in the language. I don't. Maybe if a listener knows the history of it, but at some point it seems like it was in the language, and people were referred to as a diddley bow, and probably didn't have the best connotation, just because of the history of the instrument. I know something that I read or heard was that diddley bow meant that it was like a misbehaving child or something like that, troublemaker. So either way, he took on the name Bo Diddley, and his first song was also called Bo Diddley. Early on, earlier performances, before he was signed, the song was called Uncle John. And Bo Diddley was a hit in 1955. On that same record, the B-side was I'm a Man, which Muddy Waters records as Manish Boy, which was a big hit for him. It was also a hit for Bo Diddley, but I think the more well-known version is Muddy Waters' Manish Boy. He continued to write hits after that to 1960. He's really well known as, he's a great guitarist. He's known as an innovative guitarist, and he was also known for his so much showmanship and personality. He had a very clear stage presence, and that's a component, I think, of rock and roll. As these rock and roll artists transitioned to something that was known in the pop charts and pop culture, you saw a lot of these guys become kind of bigger than life personalities, and something that, in addition to their prolific playing and ability to just to contribute to the evolution of the genre, it was also something that these record companies probably were looking for, knowing that this was kind of the direction that things were going as far as having that personality to embody like what a rock star is and would become. And one of his things that people remember him for is he had this box-shaped guitar that he'd play for. It became his signature guitar. And he also, at the time, had a louder sound. And I know Muddy Waters, that's something that we talked about with him, is trying to, have a sound that was able to hang with him and play loud and cut through the club atmosphere. And Bo Diddley actually ended up modifying his amplifier to get the sound he wanted. And another aspect of Bo Diddley is he really focused on rhythm. It's kind of what set him apart. He kind of developed his own signature rhythm that became known as the Diddley beat. And it resembles the beat of the clave, which is frequently used in Caribbean music. And before that, it dates back to West Africa, West African tribes. And in the U.S., that beat is known as a juba beat or the ham bone beat rhythm. And so that beat, which would go on to be used in later genres, but it kind of became it was known as kind of his signature style when you listen to his music, that rhythm. And it's one interesting note is I did bring that up before when we were talking about Good Rocking Tonight. So it was used in other genres, but it was not necessarily all attributed to Bo Diddley. This was, as I just said, this has roots from it has the oldest roots go back to Africa, and it found its way to the U.S. in a variety of ways. So people often refer to it as a Diddley beat, but obviously it existed already to some extent in music, and Bo Diddley to some extent really just harnessed that and made that his signature. And so like other artists that I've talked about in this episode, as the music phenomenon known as the British Invasion, I've started not to say British Invasion because I think if people don't have that history, and I just say British Invasion, they might not know what that means. So I refer to it now as the music phenomenon known as the British Invasion. The British Invasion, as I said, it contributed to a blues revival, but for a lot of the rock and roll artists who, at the time when that happened were really at the peak of their career, they found themselves kind of demoted to this nostalgic concert performances where they're playing their rock and roll hits over and over, because that time period we just saw rock and roll really evolve into something else, and these musicians didn't really change their style, even though I think Bo Diddley specifically, his style was probably his style really contributed to some of the later rock sounds. If you listen to some of his songs, he has like if you listen to Who Do You Love, which has been covered by a number of artists. I think George Thorogood and George Thorogood and the Destroyers is the name of his band. I think they probably have one of the most well-known versions. But if you listen to his version, it's almost you can almost extract like this kind of punk, garage band rock sound out of it. But either way, he, like many others, their rock and roll careers kind of dove down, and blues kind of continued to it's kind of revived. I know the British Invasion specifically is known as kind of this blues rock movement, where blues was really at the base of a lot of it, and so, and a lot of these, as I just said with the Beatles and a lot of these other artists, really called out some of their influences, and a lot of people started to tune in to some of these not older blues artists. The country blues also had a revival, but a lot of it was focused on electric blues because it really paired well with the rock music that was coming forth, where rock and roll was kind of it was almost like a phase when you zoom out and look at it in its entirety. As I mentioned before, blues kind of continues to extend. You can find blues artists today that are doing pretty well. You can think about like Gary Clark Jr., Marcus King Band is pretty big. And there's a number of other artists who are still, making a living on that. But when you think about rock and roll, it was more of a period genre where people specifically reference, you're looking for a cover by this rock and roll artist, or for the rock and roll artists that are still around, you can go see them, and they're mostly, performing their old hits. And so it's interesting, and I think it kind of goes back to what we talked about in the last episode with the way R&B came into existence as far as industry, labeling R&B rather than the artist, naturally naming the genre or just saying like this is jump blues, and recognizing that, and jump blues naturally, as we've seen, it naturally evolves into rock and roll. And so I think when you try to extract rock and roll out of the scene, you can see how it was just a part of that continued evolution into other music, and into pop music, just rock. Because at this point, all of a sudden, rock and roll is transforming into pop. It's contributing to integrated clubs. Everybody's listening to it. So now, not only is the black community the primary consumer of the music, but now everybody is listening to. You have all these different artists covering it, and so at this point, just becomes something altogether, and it really just becomes many different genres. And then the blues, which is still wrapped up into this, this obviously on the timeline, it's wrapped up in this whole thing, jump blues, you have all these sort of coexisting genres that started from the beginning and have continued to progress in their own ways. And one of those ways was jump blues to rock and roll, and the blues continued to do its own thing. And I think the fact that the blues was more of a niche genre, it was, kind of kept within the culture to some extent. It didn't have the same sort of pop success without, people really referring to the blues directly, and, without people really extracting it and turning it into rock and, later genres. It kind of was able to continue on its own, where rock and roll, like I said, is more of a phase in the evolution, if that makes sense, of wherever jump blues was headed. And, it continues to evolve. Of course, we see it later on. We see it in funk, which is really the next core genre that we eventually talk about. And of course, we see components of it later on in the later versions, reiterations of R&B, where R&B becomes more what we think of today as R&B. And I think that's more of the natural evolution to where it was going to be. Rock and roll was really a huge cultural moment in American history, and it's really, a key where we saw all of a sudden this music that was more restricted to black culture, which was essentially labeled as R&B charts, and really spill over into pop culture and just define that era. And I think the success of these musicians was sort of inflated in a way that it wouldn't have been sustainable for them, and they kind of went away as rock and roll went away, essentially, or morphed or evolved, however you want to phrase it. And so that's basically Bo Diddley. Bo Diddley also, he passed away in, I believe, 2007, 2006 or 2007. So he's around, till fairly recently as well. And that's Bo Diddley, and that is all the artists on the timeline. I suspect that as we continue, more and more of these artists will be people who have heard of. None of these artists, the timeline really kind of encapsulates some of the rock and roll artist success, because specifically Little Richard, he has multiple songs on the timeline. And then in the next episode, we'll continue to talk about a couple more, well, I guess just one more rock and roller. And we see the shift into R&B, and also we start to see the early formations of funk. Well, funk artists, we're not really getting to funk yet, but we get into the rock and roll and really the height of what I think people consider R&B, but a lot of that is encapsulated into what is known as Motown records, which was very dominant during this next time period. So we'll start to get into that in the next episode. I guess there's two more rock and roll artists now that I look, but it's still a little bit murky. It's always murky, as we have learned. I think one of the main takeaways is that really what was rock and roll was just a continuation of the jump blues. And we can see it kind of evolve into these other things as we move along. But I guess that's it for this episode. Once again, thanks for tuning in. And I look forward to this next episode as we keep moving on. I think, the history is always interesting, but, this journey through the timeline becomes more fascinating as things get a little bit more murky and mixed up. I think I almost enjoy the gray area more than the kind of definitive black and white where we saw early on the blues. It was a little bit more clear cut. Everything was intentionally, separated, and we didn't see as much of what we're seeing now, where what we're seeing with the crossover of a lot of these stars into just mainstream culture. So we'll get into that more next episode. Thanks for listening.